Jimmy Martin died without ever receiving bluegrass's highest honor, forever standing outside the Hall of Fame built by the man he helped immortalize. It was the final brutal cost of the most perfect harmony born from the most bitter war. That harmony was called the High Lonely Sound. The war was between Bill Monroe, the father, and Jimmy Martin, the fireball, an illusion of unity forged in pride, jealousy, and 50 years of deep-seated resentment. This is not a story about bluegrass. This is the autopsy of a feud and an indictment of the price paid, not only by the man who built the kingdom, but by the man whose voice was its defining sound, but who was forever denied entry. William Smith Monroe was born on September 13, 1911, in Rosine, Kentucky, a world before electricity where music was not entertainment, but a fundamental part of daily life. His life was shaped from its first moments by the sounds that filled his home, the prize-winning fiddle playing of his father, Buck, and the ancient Scottish-Irish ballads sung by his mother, Melissa. From the very beginning, Bill was an outsider. A childhood accident left him with permanent strabismus, a crossed eye that, in the harsh culture of rural Kentucky, made him a target. His older, normal brothers, Birch and Charlie, teased him without mercy, pushing him to the edges of the family circle. He retreated inward, becoming sullen and quiet, finding his only sanctuary in the music of his mother, Melissa, who shielded her sensitive, different son from the world. When Bill was just 10, his mother's death destroyed that refuge. His mother died in 1921 after a long illness, leaving the home not just without a mother, but without its music. His father, Buck, remarried and passed away himself in 1928. By 16, Bill Monroe was essentially an orphan, abandoned and shuffled between relatives who treated him as a burden. The isolation he felt as a child became his absolute reality, until he was finally sent to live with his masterful fiddler uncle, Pendleton Penn Vandiver. In the chaos of his orphaning, Bill clung to one relic, his mother's mandolin, while his brothers had claimed the prestige instruments of the fiddle and guitar. Bill was left with the weak parlor instrument, but in his hands, the mandolin became his defense. He would go to the cornfields and attack those 8 strings, developing a percussive, hammering chop rhythm. It was a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to make his small instrument sound as loud as his brothers. And when he sang over it, it wasn't singing. It was the high, lonesome sound, the scream of an orphan shouting into the void. 16 years later, a parallel tragedy was taking shape in Sneedville, Tennessee. On August 10, 1927, James Henry Martin was born into a world of brutal, desperate poverty. One of 10 children, Jimmy's childhood was a daily physical fight for survival. Like Bill, he lost his father at a young age, but his reaction was the polar opposite. Bill retreated inward. Jimmy exploded outward. He became high-strung, a volatile time bomb of emotion and ambition, forged in the fistfights he needed to win to prove he even existed. Jimmy also found his escape in music, but if Bill's mandolin was a defensive shield, Jimmy's guitar was an offensive weapon, played with a relentless drive to punch through his poverty. But he had another coping mechanism, a secret he hid for decades. At just 15, Jimmy Martin started drinking to numb the hunger, the cold, and the humiliation. While Bill Monroe turned to his mother's mandolin to hide his pain, Jimmy Martin turned to the bottle, setting the stage for the violent mood swings that would one day fuel his genius and destroy his life. Back on the first path, Bill Monroe had migrated north to Indiana, trading the fields of Rosine for the sulfurous stench of the Sinclair refinery. It was in this harsh industrial world that Bill met his secret teacher, Arnold Schultz, a brilliant African-American blues musician. Bill crossed the rigid racial lines of the 1930s to learn from Schultz, who taught him the swing and blue notes of the blues. It was this unacknowledged influence that provided the final, soulful ingredient for his revolutionary sound. Armed with this new sound, Bill and his brother Charlie formed the Monroe Brothers and became stars on the WLS National Barn Dance. But the old demon of control returned. Bill, the artist, was still being treated like the cross-eyed little brother, forced to sing harmony while his brother Charlie sang lead. In 1938, after a bitter fight, Bill did the unthinkable. He quit the band at its peak, vowing he would never again be a sideman. He moved to Nashville to form his own band, Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, ensuring no one would ever question who was the boss. Meanwhile, Jimmy Martin's obsession was the radio. He was mesmerized by the sound Bill Monroe had created with his new band, specifically the classic lineup with Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. Jimmy moved his young family to Nashville, but the dream was a nightmare. He ended up a car mechanic, humiliated and desperate, just miles from the Grand Ole Opry. It was at this exact moment in 1948 that Flatt and Scruggs quit, betraying Bill and becoming his biggest rivals. This left Bill, the father of bluegrass, depressed, failing, and desperate for a new, loyal voice. And so in October 1949, a 22-year-old, arrogant, volatile car mechanic, his hands still stained with grease, walked in for an audition. The architect, Bill Monroe, was sitting on his broken throne, wounded by betrayal and suspicious of everyone. The fire, Jimmy Martin, was standing at the door, starving for success and ready to burn. The stage was set for the greatest and most tragic partnership in American music history. This wasn't just an audition, it was a confrontation between the future and the past. On one side, Bill Monroe, 38 years old, a wounded legend, sits in shadow, his damaged eye making his gaze unreadable, intense. He's a man of profound, intimidating silences, the gatekeeper. On the other side, James Henry Martin, 22 years old, arrogant, loud, and visibly high-strung, radiating ambition and the desperation to escape a life of grinding poverty. He wasn't just auditioning for a job, he was auditioning for his life. "Play something," Monroe would have grunted. Jimmy picked up his guitar and didn't strum. He attacked. He unleashed a percussive, relentless drive, a runaway train of sound he was punching out of the guitar. Monroe's head would have snapped up. And then Jimmy Martin opened his mouth to sing. It was not a sweet or polite voice. It was a weapon. It was a high, reedy, impossibly powerful wail that cut through the air like a razor, the sound of pure, unadulterated trouble. If Monroe's voice was the high, lonesome sound, this was the high, lonesome fire. In that moment, Monroe was stunned. He was looking in a mirror, hearing the echo of his own lonesome wail from the cornfields of Rosine, but amplified, weaponized, and staring him in the face with defiant confidence. He knew instantly this was the only voice on earth that could make the world forget Lester Flatt. But he also must have felt a cold knot of dread. This was not a soldier he could control. The audition was over. Monroe, in his typically understated way, simply said, "You're hired." The 5-year war and the golden age had begun. The impact was immediate. Jimmy Martin didn't just join the Bluegrass Boys, he transformed the band. His relentless, aggressive guitar drive became the new engine, perfectly matching Monroe's mandolin and propelling the group with unprecedented force. But the true magic was the vocal blend. Bill Monroe, the man who swore he would never sing harmony again after his brothers humiliated him, did the most shocking thing of his career. He stepped back from the lead microphone. He recognized Martin's voice as a lead instrument of unparalleled power, and moved into his own God-given spot, the high tenor harmony. The sound they created wasn't just harmony, it was an intense, perfectly blended third voice emerging from their unique combination, tight and almost painfully precise. Jimmy's lead provided the raw emotional grounding. Bill's tenor added the high, lonesome spiritual echo. Together, their voices captured the full spectrum of Appalachian pain and beauty. They entered the Decca Studios, and for 5 solid years, they were untouchable, re-energizing standards like Footprints in the Snow and recording emotionally raw masterpieces like My Little Georgia Rose. And then, in 1950, came the sacred text. Bill Monroe wrote a song, a tribute to the man who had raised him, the man who had been his true father and musical mentor, Uncle Pen. This was more than just a song. It was deeply personal, reflecting Monroe's origins and the most formative relationship of his musical life. And who did he choose to sing the lead vocal? Not himself. He gave it to Jimmy Martin. Think about that. Think about the trust that required. Bill Monroe, the man defined by his traumatic past, handed the story of that past to this 23-year-old fireball, this kid he'd just hired from a garage. That's how profound their musical bond was. Monroe knew that only Martin's voice, only that perfect, declarative, fiery tenor, could do justice to the legend of the man who had saved him. They were unstoppable. They owned the Grand Ole Opry. Backstage at the Ryman Auditorium, other acts would literally stop what they were doing to watch them. When Monroe and Martin stepped up to that single microphone, the energy in the room would crackle. They were the main event. They were the sound of Nashville. They were selling hundreds of thousands of records. It was during this period that Billboard magazine, the Bible of the industry, reportedly first called Jimmy Martin the voice of bluegrass. And it was this sound, this specific high-octane, vocally driven sound, that finally cemented the term bluegrass for the entire genre. Bill Monroe had created it. Flatt and Scruggs had popularized it. But it was the partnership of Bill Monroe and Jimmy Martin that defined it. They were the peak, the pinnacle, the gold standard. It was a perfect musical marriage. But here's the thing about perfect marriages, especially in music, they rarely last. The very things that made them magic were the same things that would tear them apart. The public saw the harmony. They didn't see the war brewing backstage. The core of the tragedy is this. Bill Monroe hired Jimmy Martin because he was like him, and he ultimately destroyed their partnership because he was too much like him. This wasn't just a boss-employee relationship. It was a complex psychological dynamic between a controlling patriarch and his most talented, volatile protege. On one side, you have Bill Monroe, the father, the architect, the man whose entire life was a quest for control, a quest born from the trauma of his childhood. He had been bullied by his brothers. He had been abandoned by Flatt and Scruggs. He demanded loyalty. He demanded it not as a boss, but as a patriarch. He expected his bluegrass boys to be just that, his boys. He expected gratitude. He expected obedience. He believed in a stoic, almost severe professionalism. You show up, you do the work, you don't show off, and you respect the man whose name is on the sign. He was a man of quiet, passive-aggressive control. And on the other side, you have Jimmy Martin, the sun, the fire. He was not a soldier. He was a 5-star general. He was the man who had fought for every scrap his entire life. He was loud, he was arrogant, he was a natural-born showman. He needed the spotlight. He didn't see himself as an employee. He saw himself as a partner. And in his heart, he believed he was the star. The cracks began to show almost immediately. On stage, Monroe demanded a dignified, almost static presentation, just the music. But Jimmy couldn't help himself. He was a born entertainer. He'd crack jokes. He'd flirt with the audience. He'd step up to the microphone with a swagger that screamed, "Look at me." To Monroe, this was the ultimate sign of disrespect. It was showboating. It was undermining his authority as the leader. Then there was the money. This was the big one. This was 1951. They were the biggest act in bluegrass, selling records by the truckload. And Jimmy Martin, the star vocalist, the voice of bluegrass, was still making a sideman's salary. Some sources say it was as low as $50 a week. $50. For Jimmy, keenly aware of the poverty he'd escaped and the recent memory of working as a mechanic, this felt like an insult. He saw Monroe, the father, getting rich off his voice, his fire. He would complain, he would demand raises. To Monroe, this was not a business negotiation. It was a betrayal. It was ingratitude. "I made you," was his unspoken attitude. "I brought you out of the garage. You should be grateful just to be here." The tension was becoming unbearable, and Jimmy's old demons were catching up. The high-strung kid who drank to cope with poverty was now a high-strung star who drank to cope with the pressure. His mood swings, fueled by alcohol and his simmering resentment, became legendary. He was volatile. He was unpredictable. Add to this the pressures of the road. In 1952, the band was in a serious car accident that badly injured their fiddle player, Chubby Wise. For Jimmy, who craved stability, this was a terrifying reminder of how fragile it all was. Meanwhile, Monroe was dealing with his own demons. His old back injury, a painful souvenir from his days in the oil refinery, was flaring up. He was in constant, agonizing pain. This made the already stoic man even more irritable, more withdrawn, more demanding. They were two wounded lions circling each other in the same cage. The architect in pain and demanding control. The fire, fueled by alcohol and demanding respect. It was a powder keg. And in 1953, someone lit the fuse. The professional tension was one thing. This was another. This was the wound from which the partnership would never recover. Jimmy Martin, the brash, handsome 20-something-year-old lead singer, the king of swagger, the man who thought he could have anything he wanted, did the one thing, the only thing, that was truly unforgivable. He started a secret relationship. He began dating Bill Monroe's daughter. Let that sink in. Bill Monroe, the ultimate patriarch. The man whose control over his world was absolute. The man who viewed his band as his family and his family as his property. His daughter, Melissa, was royalty. She was the princess of the bluegrass kingdom. And his employee, this loud, unreliable, hard-drinking sideman, was sneaking around with her. According to T.A. Stevens' definitive biography, True Adventures with the King of Bluegrass, when Monroe found out, the rage was biblical. This wasn't a business dispute anymore. This wasn't about money or who got the spotlight. This was a profound personal and, in Monroe's eyes, dishonorable violation. It was a stab in the back. It was the ultimate betrayal of the father by the son. The musical magic was instantly irrelevant. The harmony on stage was now a grotesque lie. Every time they stepped up to that microphone together, every time their voices blended in that perfect, heartbreaking harmony, Monroe wasn't looking at his star singer. He was looking at the boy who had disrespected his blood. The final year, from 1953 to 1954, was a slow, agonizing death. The recording studios, once their sanctuary, became a torture chamber. The tension was so thick you could hear it on the tapes. They were still making brilliant music, but the joy was gone. It was replaced by a cold, desperate precision. They were fighting constantly about money, about song choices, about everything. But they were never talking about the real thing. They were never talking about his daughter. The end came not with a whimper, but with a crash. The most famous story from that final toxic year is of Jimmy Martin in a fit of pure, unadulterated rage, fueled by alcohol, by the insults, by the impossible tension, doing the one thing a musician should never do. He smashed his guitar right there on stage. It was a symbolic act. The instrument of their harmony, the engine of their sound, shattered into pieces. It was a violent public severing of the tie. The breakup itself in 1954 is murky. There was no press release. It was just over. Martin would always claim he quit. Monroe would imply he was fired. The truth is, it doesn't matter. The partnership had become psychologically impossible. The fire had become too hot for the architect to control. The son had finally and unforgivably defied the father. The 5-year golden age was over. The greatest, most important, and most tragic partnership in the history of bluegrass had shattered. Bill Monroe was alone again, wounded again, betrayed again. He would retreat even further into his fortress of solitude, his heart hardened, his rules of control becoming absolute. He would spend the rest of his life searching for another Jimmy Martin, another voice that could match his, but he would never find one. And Jimmy Martin, Emmy was finally free, but also exiled from Monroe's world. But he was alive, and he was now possessed by a new, all-consuming purpose. It wasn't just to be a star, it was to get revenge. He was going to prove to Bill Monroe and to the world that he didn't need the father. He was going to build his own kingdom. The stage was now set for the real war. The war between the Father of Bluegrass and the man who would crown himself the king. The real war would not be fought with fists. It would be a cold war of bitter pride and psychological warfare. The silence that followed the 1954 breakup was not a peaceful one. It was the deafening, ringing silence that follows a massive explosion. The 5-year partnership, the most dynamic and important in the history of American folk music, had detonated. The two men who had stood so close they breathed the same air, their voices blending into a single supernatural sound, were now flung to opposite ends of the musical universe, propelled by the shrapnel of pride, ego, and profound personal betrayal. For Jimmy Martin, the 27-year-old fireball, the first feeling was likely a dizzying, terrifying rush of freedom. For the first time in his adult life, he was his own boss. He was no longer the boy, the sideman, the employee. He was free from the oppressive, judgmental gaze of his musical father. But freedom is a terrifying thing when you have a wife, a young son, and you've just declared war on the man who was, for all intents and purposes, the god of your industry. Jimmy Martin had just walked out on Bill Monroe. In 1954, Nashville, that was seen as a potentially career-ending move. He had no band, no record deal, and no powerful friends. All he had was a beat-up guitar, a voice that could peel paint off a wall, and a burning, all-consuming need to prove that the father was wrong. For Bill Monroe, the 43-year-old patriarch, the feeling was a cold, familiar ache. The silence in the rehearsal room, the empty space next to him at the microphone, it was the sound of 1948 all over again. It was the sound of betrayal. His brothers had left him. Flatt and Scruggs had left him. And now Martin, the one he had handpicked from a garage, the one he had gifted his most sacred songs, his son had also abandoned him. The wound was reopened. Monroe retreated even further into his fortress of solitude. He became harder, more suspicious, more obsessed with control. If the world was going to keep taking things from him, he would build his walls so high that no one could ever get in again. The Great War had begun, a Cold War fought with song choices, radio airplay, and bitter secrets. The architect, wounded and defensive, held his ground, while the fire, finally unleashed, set out to burn the whole kingdom down. Jimmy Martin's first move was one of pure, defiant survival. He had to build an army, and he had to do it fast. He couldn't just be a bluegrass singer. He had to be the alternative to Bill Monroe. If Monroe's sound was the high lonesome, Martin's would be the high power. He set out to find musicians who could keep up with his relentless drive. And this is where Jimmy Martin's own, often overlooked genius as a bandleader truly shines. He didn't just look for players, he looked for firepower. He recruited a brilliant young banjo player named J.D. Crowe and a mandolin player with a soaring tenor voice named Paul Williams. He called his new band Jimmy Martin and the Sunny Mountain Boys. The name itself was a mission statement. It was a direct contrast to Monroe's Bluegrass. It wasn't blue and lonesome. It was sunny and optimistic. It was a commercial, accessible, and audacious brand. But there was a problem, a big one. Where would he record? He couldn't go to Decca Records. That was Monroe's label. He was an outcast. He took his band on the road, playing tiny clubs, honing their sound, all while living hand to mouth, the fear of returning to poverty constantly driving him. And here, in the wilderness, the first strange secret twist in this feud occurred. In 1955, less than a year after the bitter breakup, Bill Monroe and Jimmy Martin were allegedly brought back together for a secret recording session. Think about that. The wounds were still raw, the betrayal of Monroe's daughter still fresh, but the sound, the magic was so potent that a record label tried to bottle it one last time. These became the legendary Lost Sessions. The recordings, if they ever truly existed, were shelved, allegedly due to the same arguments that broke them up in the first place: money, control, and publishing rights. They were too proud to work together, but they couldn't deny the magic. It was the first sign that their connection, however fraught, remained incredibly strong and complex. Cast back out, Martin finally got his break. He signed with RCA Records, and in 1955, he unleashed his first hits as a solo artist: Rock Hearts, Ocean of Diamonds, Sunny Side of the Mountain. The music was a revelation. It was bluegrass, but it was a different beast. The guitar was the lead instrument, a percussive engine pushing the beat. The vocals were pristine, but they were also muscular. It was the sound of a man not asking for your attention, but demanding it. It was the sound of defiance. It was a commercial triumph. Jimmy Martin was no longer Bill Monroe's lead singer. He was a star in his own right. He was touring internationally. He was a headliner. And in the mid-1960s, in an interview with Billboard magazine, he did the one thing that would irrevocably escalate his feud with Monroe. He gave himself a title, a name, a crown. If Bill Monroe was the father of bluegrass, Jimmy Martin declared that he was the king of bluegrass. The king of bluegrass. Think about the sheer audacity of that claim. This wasn't just clever marketing. This was a profound psychological declaration of war. In a royal court, a king outranks a father. A king rules. The father is just the past. This was Jimmy Martin, the boy from Sneedville, the kid who had to fight for every scrap, the man who was defined by his all-consuming, desperate need for respect, finally screaming at the one man whose respect he craved most. He was saying, "You may have created this world, Bill, but I own it now." It was an act of immense arrogance, likely born from deep insecurity. He needed a title, a crown, a symbol of validation because he knew that Bill Monroe would never, ever give it to him. And how did Monroe, the father, react? Publicly, he said nothing. Monroe was a master of the dignified, dismissive silence. He would never, ever validate Martin's claim by even acknowledging it. When asked, he would simply refer to Martin as a former bluegrass boy, demoting him back to the rank of employee. But privately, Monroe was incensed. He reportedly told his bandmates and friends that Martin was a troublemaker, a braggart. The King moniker was to Monroe the ultimate act of disrespect. It was the son not just leaving the house, but trying to burn it down and build a bigger, gaudier one right next door. While Jimmy was building his new sunny kingdom, Bill Monroe's world was getting smaller and darker. The late 1950s were not kind to Bill Monroe. Rock and roll was exploding. His old disciples, Flatt and Scruggs, were becoming massive television stars with their theme song for the Beverly Hillbillies, their sound now smoother, more commercial. Monroe, the traditionalist, the purist, was being left behind. He was becoming a relic. His record sales plummeted. He was playing to smaller and smaller crowds, and he remained fixated on his conflict with Jimmy Martin. He spent the next decade on a desperate, almost obsessive quest to replace the voice he had cast out. He was searching for the next Jimmy Martin. He hired a revolving door of brilliant young singer-guitarists, Carter Stanley, Del McCoury, Peter Rowan. Each one was a legend in their own right, but it never worked. Psychologically, he couldn't let it. He would hire them, try to mold them into Martin, and then, when they either failed to be Martin or worse, succeeded too well and showed a spark of Martin's defiant brilliance, he would suppress them. He'd turn their microphones down. He'd refuse to let them sing lead on the big songs. He was sabotaging his own music because his need for control was now greater than his need for perfection. He was so terrified of being betrayed again, so terrified of creating another king, that he stifled his own band's potential. He was isolated and defensive, wary of anyone who challenged his control. And then, in 1954, the ultimate irony, the ultimate insult. That Elvis Presley, a young, hip-swiveling kid from Tupelo, had taken Monroe's sacred waltz, Blue Moon of Kentucky, and turned it into a rock and roll anthem. He'd sped it up, added drums, added a swagger that was pure, sexualized energy. To Bill Monroe, this was sacrilege. It was everything he hated. It was electrified. It was disrespectful to the tradition. It was a hit, a massive culture-defining hit. Monroe was trapped. He was publicly complimentary. He'd say, well, it's fine. It's good for my publishing. But privately, he was horrified. This wasn't his music. It felt like a commercialized caricature of his artistic expression. But then, the mailman started coming. The royalty checks for Elvis's version of Blue Moon of Kentucky were, by far, the biggest checks Bill Monroe had ever seen. The story goes that the checks were so large, they single-handedly saved him from financial ruin during his leanest commercial years. This is the central paradox of Bill Monroe's life. He was saved financially by the very musical revolution that was trying to kill him. He was a traditionalist purist whose bank account was funded by the king of rock and roll. This only made him dig his heels in deeper. If the world wanted rock and roll, he would give them something even more pure, even more traditional. He became the defiant gatekeeper of the old sound. And then, just as he was becoming this rigid icon, his body betrayed him. In 1965, Bill Monroe was in a horrific car accident. He was severely injured, multiple broken bones. He was hospitalized for 6 months. He would never be the same. The accident left him with chronic, agonizing pain for the rest of his life. And to manage that pain, Bill Monroe, the stoic, God-fearing patriarch, became dependent on prescription painkillers. Think about the symmetry, the beautiful, terrible, tragic symmetry. By the mid-1960s, you have two men, the two pillars of bluegrass, both crippled by addiction. In one corner, you have Jimmy Martin, the king, an out-of-control alcoholic. His volatility and mood swings becoming the stuff of legend. He's alienating his band, drinking his way through his profits. In the other corner, you have Bill Monroe, the father, a recluse addicted to pain pills. His bitterness and pain managed by a quiet, legal drug dependency. The fire and the architect, both self-medicating their demons, both haunted by each other, and both about to collide in the most personal and painful arena of all, the four walls of the Grand Ole Opry. Because those four walls were not just a stage, they were not just a radio show, they were the mother church of country music. To be a member of the Opry is to be anointed. It means you are not just a star, you are family. It is the one thing you cannot buy, you must be invited in. For Bill Monroe, the Opry was his home, it was his church, it was his kingdom. He had been a member since 1939. He was its patriarch, its gatekeeper. For Jimmy Martin, the Opry was the promised land. It was the one final ultimate validation. It was the only trophy that mattered. Being on the Opry meant you had made it. More importantly, it meant being invited into the Father's house. It meant all was forgiven. By the early 1960s, Jimmy Martin was, by any objective measure, a superstar. He had a string of massive hits. He was a bigger, more consistent chart topper than Bill Monroe was at that time. He was a headliner. He was a guest on the Opry, but he was not a member, so he applied, and he was rejected. It was a shock. A man of his stature, rejected? He figured it was a mistake, so he applied again, and he was rejected again and again and again for 40 years. Why? Why would the Opry deny one of the most popular, dynamic, and foundational acts in the genre? The answer was one name, Bill Monroe. This was the secret war. This was Monroe's ultimate, final, and most devastating revenge. Publicly, the Opry management had their reasons. Jimmy Martin was unreliable. He was a heavy drinker. His high-strung temperament meant he might show up late or drunk or start a fight backstage. He was a behavioral risk, but that was the excuse. The reason was Bill Monroe. Monroe, the quiet, powerful elder statesman, would reportedly go to the Opry managers, men who revered him, and gently, quietly express his concerns. A great singer, Jimmy, he might say, but he's unreliable. He's a troublemaker. He doesn't respect the institution. It was a whisper, a quiet word from the Father, but it was a veto, an absolute ironclad veto. This wasn't about behavior. This was about power. This was Monroe, the man who had been betrayed by his brothers, by Flatt and Scruggs, and by Martin, finally holding the one key to the one door his defiant son could not kick down. He was saying, you can call yourself a king all you want. You can have your hits. You can make your money, but you will never be a member of my family. You will never stand in my house. You are and always will be an outsider. This rejection, it broke Jimmy Martin. It became the central defining obsession of his life. It was a raw, open wound that would not heal. It didn't matter how many hits he had, how many fans screamed his name. That one closed door in Nashville was the only thing he could see. It fueled his drinking. It fueled his rage. It fueled his public rants against Monroe. He became a man consumed by a single injustice, and it led to one of the most pathetic and human chapters in his life. He began to believe that the only way to get in the Opry was to get a coon dog. Yes, a raccoon hunting dog. Why? Because the Opry was sponsored by a dog food company, and the company's owner, a man named Roy Acuff, was a passionate coon hunter. Jimmy, in his desperate, obsessive, and alcohol-fueled logic, believed that if he could just become Roy Acuff's hunting buddy, if he could just raise a champion coon dog, Acuff would pull strings and get him past Monroe's veto. So, Jimmy Martin, the king of bluegrass, poured his time, his money, and his obsessive energy into dog breeding. He spent years trying to breed a champion. It was a tragic, bizarre, and deeply human quest. He couldn't win the war with his music, so he was trying to win it with a hunting dog. He failed. He remained on the outside, looking in, watching as other, lesser artists were welcomed into the family. Meanwhile, his personal life, which had been strained by the road and his drinking, finally collapsed. His marriage to Maddie, the woman who had been with him since before the fame, fell apart in the 1960s. He had his kingdom. He was the king, and he was sitting on the throne all alone, drunk, angry, and locked out of the only home he ever really wanted. The father had won. He had contained the fire. He had proven that he still held all the power. But the 1960s were ending. A new decade was dawning, and a new generation was rising, a generation that didn't care about the Opry, a generation that didn't care about the old rules. They were long-haired, they were rebellious, and they were about to change the game and the fortunes of both the father and the king in a way neither of them could have ever predicted. The war wasn't over. It was just entering a new and stranger phase. The 1970s dawned on a fractured America and a fractured musical landscape. The airwaves were filled with the sounds of protest, of psychedelia, of rock operas, and sensitive singer-songwriters. And in this new, loud, and complicated world, what place was there for two men from the hills of Appalachia, both trapped in their own past? What place was there for the father of bluegrass or the king of bluegrass? As the decade began, both Bill Monroe and Jimmy Martin were, in a commercial sense, obsolete. They were two broken men left behind by the very culture they had helped to create. Monroe, now in his late 50s, was a relic, a man in a suit and hat in the era of tie-dye, his body aching from his 1965 car wreck, his mind clouded by a private painkiller addiction. Jimmy Martin, now in his 40s, was a liability. His name, once a guarantee of a hit record, was now synonymous with trouble. His alcoholism was no longer a backstage secret. It was a public spectacle. He was an angry, bitter, and marginalized man locked out of the Opry, shouting at a world that had stopped listening. Their great war seemed to have ended in a stalemate. Both men had lost. But history has a funny way of turning relics into icons. The 1970s would not be the end for these two men. It would be their great divergence. For one, it would be a miraculous, unexpected resurrection. For the other, it would be the beginning of a long, tragic, and very public fall. Bill Monroe's salvation came from the most unlikely place imaginable, the counterculture. While the Nashville establishment was chasing the slick, string-laden, country-politan sound, a new generation of musicians, long-haired, college-educated hippie kids, was rediscovering their roots. They were digging through their parents' record collections and finding the raw, authentic sounds of the past. And they found Bill Monroe, but they didn't just find him, they deified him. Young virtuosic players like Sam Bush, Tony Rice, Ricky Skaggs, and Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, they didn't see a hillbilly in a hat. They saw a revolutionary. They saw a rebel. They saw the source. To them, Monroe wasn't a relic. He was the father of American acoustic music. His fast, precise, and complex playing was like a form of acoustic heavy metal. They studied his every note. And unlike Flatt, Scruggs, or Martin, this new generation had no desire to compete with him. They didn't want to steal his crown. They wanted to sit at his feet. This changed Bill Monroe. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by sons who weren't trying to betray him. They didn't challenge his authority. They craved his approval. The old wounded lion, so used to guarding his territory, found himself in a new role, the elder statesman, the mentor. He stopped trying to find the next Jimmy Martin. He realized he didn't need to. He began to embrace these new, strange disciples. He invited them on his stage. He would stand there stone-faced as these long-haired kids took blistering rock and roll-infused solos on his sacred songs. And then he would nod, just once. That one simple nod from Bill Monroe became the single most sought-after prize in all of bluegrass. His career, which had been dying in small clubs, was reborn on the massive outdoor festival circuit. His annual festival at Bean Blossom, Indiana, became his new kingdom. It was his personal Opry, a place where he was the gatekeeper, and he welcomed everyone. It became a yearly pilgrimage, a Woodstock of bluegrass, where the hippies and the old-timers mixed, all united by their shared love for the Father. His vindication was immense. He was touring again, playing to adoring college crowds who treated him like a god. Bill Monroe had won. He had outlasted his rivals. He had found a new, loyal family. He was finally and truly the undisputed father of bluegrass. And while the father was being celebrated on the festival stage, the king was rotting in a bar. The 1970s were the cruelest decade for Jimmy Martin. Every triumph for Monroe was a new, fresh hell for him. While Monroe was being rediscovered by a new generation, Jimmy's sound was hopelessly trapped, failing commercially and leaving the king of bluegrass playing to thinning crowds in rough honky-tonks. His alcoholism was in full control, curdling his high-strung personality into a dark, unpredictable rage, and his obsession with Monroe and the Opry metastasized. This culminated in a legendary 1975 Bluegrass Unlimited interview, an outpouring of bitterness in which he publicly accused Monroe of actively sabotaging his career and famously claimed, "I made Bill Monroe." Monroe's response to this public declaration of war was a cold, dismissive, and utterly devastating silence. He didn't need to respond. He had already won. Jimmy's public rants only proved Monroe's quiet warnings that the man was a troublemaker. In a brilliant and desperate countermove, Jimmy decided to launch a proxy war. In 1972, he sought out Bill's estranged older brother, Charlie Monroe, convincing the long-retired man to tour with him. It was a staggering act of passive aggression, in effect resurrecting the Monroe brothers, with himself in Bill's slot, a public psychological jab designed to inflict maximum personal pain. But the story, already a complex tragedy, becomes almost Shakespearean. At the exact same time in 1972, while Jimmy was publicly parading Charlie Monroe like a war trophy, he hit financial rock bottom. He was broke, his decades of hard living had caught up with him, and he was about to lose his home. He then received a mysterious envelope with a lifeline of cash. The money appeared to come from his new touring partner, Charlie, but a secret kept for decades revealed the truth. The money wasn't from Charlie, it was through him. The lifeline had come from Bill Monroe. This one, secret act reveals the entire twisted and unbreakable bond between them. Bill Monroe, the man who was being publicly humiliated by his greatest rival, the man who was actively blackballing him from the Opry, secretly sent him money. He couldn't stand his success, but he couldn't bear his failure either. Was it guilt, a final paternal instinct for the son he cast out? Or was it the ultimate act of patriarchal control, ensuring his greatest protege's ruin would not become a public embarrassment? It revealed the depth of their complex connection. They couldn't reconcile, yet couldn't completely sever the tie. The secret lifeline didn't solve Jimmy's problems. It was a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. The rage and drinking continued until 1978, when the bottom fell out and he was hospitalized for life-threatening delirium tremens. 2 years later, he hit financial rock bottom, declaring bankruptcy. As Jimmy was at his nadir, a parallel tragedy struck the father. In 1982, Bill Monroe's brother Birch passed away. The man who began his life as an isolated child was now, at 70, the sole patriarch, completely and utterly alone. These events set their final diverging paths. In the 1980s, Jimmy Martin, now in his 50s, was a ghost. Sober than not, his health failing, a man defined by his bitterness. Bill Monroe in his 70s was no longer a man. He was a monument. When the new International Bluegrass Music Association was formed, its inaugural Hall of Fame induction class included a formality, Bill Monroe. His vindication was complete. Jimmy Martin's name was brought up, but the old whispers of behavioral problems resurfaced. The man whose voice had defined the genre was passed over. The war was over. The father had won. Bill Monroe's victory was not just commercial, it was absolute. The 1980s enshrined him as a living god. He was the dean of the Grand Ole Opry, the very institution he had so effectively barred his rival from. His 1970 Country Music Hall of Fame induction and his 1991 IBMA honors were the final stamps on his legacy. His art flourished, releasing the 1989 masterpiece Southern Flavor and touring the world as a cultural statesman. The isolated, cross-eyed boy from Rosine had outlived his rivals and outrun his demons. He had everything. And then there was the king. While the father was accepting Lifetime Achievement Awards, the king was in exile. Jimmy Martin's 1980s and early 90s were a tragic mirror image of Monroe's triumph. His health was failing, ravaged by decades of hard drinking and the quiet work of cancer. His career as a recording force was over. He was a ghost, a special guest playing with those who, unlike him, had made peace with the Father. But his pride was far from extinguished. As his influence waned, his claims grew louder, becoming a desperate, rambling cry for validation. Bill Monroe didn't have no bluegrass till I come along. I put the drive in it. His accusations met with Monroe's continued public silence. He had lost the war of legacy. He was sick, and he was being forgotten. As his career faded into exile, he recorded one of his last albums and gave it a title that was perhaps the greatest Freudian slip in music history, Me and Old Bill. It was a title of staggering psychological depth, a tribute, a plea, and a final heartbreaking admission. With that one title, the king was admitting that his entire identity, that me, did not and could not exist without Old Bill. It was the son, still raging against his father, but also screaming, "Look at us. Look what we did. It was us, Bill, me, and you." It was the closest thing to a reconciliation he could offer, and like previous attempts, it was met with Monroe's silence. By 1995, Jimmy Martin knew he was running out of time. His cancer was progressing, and Bill Monroe, now in his 80s, was also visibly frail. The great 50-year war suddenly felt small in the face of the inevitable. One night, alone, the king finally broke. He sat down and, as his son would later reveal, wrote a letter to Bill Monroe. It was the letter he had been trying to write for 40 years. The confession, the apology, the plea, a letter of regret for the lost years and the beautiful music they could have made. He finished the letter. He held in his hand the one thing that could have ended the war and brought him peace, and he never sent it. He couldn't do it. Even at the end, his pride, or perhaps his terror, was stronger than his need for reconciliation. He couldn't make himself vulnerable to the Father one last time, couldn't risk the final definitive rejection of an unanswered letter, which would have been worse than any Opry snub. So he kept the letter, a secret testament to a peace that would never come. The window had closed. In the spring of 1996, the inevitable happened. Bill Monroe, the father, the architect, the 84-year-old giant, suffered a massive stroke. He lingered for months, but he was gone. On September 9th, 1996, just 4 days shy of his 85th birthday, William Smith Monroe died. The architect's funeral was a state occasion, held at the Ryman Auditorium, the mother church, the one building Jimmy Martin had spent his life trying to get into. The pews were filled with music royalty, from Emmylou Harris to Ricky Skaggs, all there to pay tribute. And then there was Jimmy, a broken man in his late 60s, ravaged by cancer, watching with a stony face. In the climactic scene of their 50-year drama, he was approached and invited on stage to sing. It was his final invitation to the Opry, his last chance to be part of the family, his last chance to sing for his father. The entire church held its breath. And Jimmy Martin, the king of bluegrass, said no. His refusal was his final bitter, heartbroken word in their long, terrible duet. What did that no mean? Was it the ultimate act of defiance? You wouldn't let me sing on this stage in my prime? I damn sure won't be a prop at your funeral? Was it the crushing weight of his own grief or the rage of an unsent letter? Or was it perhaps the most human reason of all? The knowledge that if he opened his mouth, his voice would betray him, and the only sound to come out would be a half-century of heartbroken sobs. The king would not be seen to cry. The man with the loudest, most fiery voice in bluegrass history chose silence. The funeral was over. The father was in the ground. The war was over, and in the end, there was no victor, only a survivor. Jimmy Martin walked out of the Ryman Auditorium, not into the sunlight, but into the long, cold twilight of his own life. What happens to a man whose entire identity was defined by a single epic battle when the other combatant leaves the field? He becomes a ghost. The last 7 years of Jimmy Martin's life, from 1997 to 2005, were a painful epilogue. He was a man untethered, a planet knocked from its orbit, left to spin alone in the cold, empty void once filled by the gravitational pull of Bill Monroe. His health began its final rapid decline. The cancer, the hard living, the decades of alcohol, and the high-strung adrenaline that had fueled him, it had all come due. In an irony as cruel as it was complete, the man with the most powerful and indestructible voice in bluegrass was now being silenced by a disease of the lungs. He still performed, but the fire was banked. The king was now a legend, which is a polite word for a man who belongs to the past. He would show up at festivals, a man out of time, and he would tell his stories. Oh, the stories. They were all he had left. He became consumed by his own narrative, repeatedly recounting the grievances of his conflict with Monroe. He would corner anyone who would listen and lay it all out, his voice thinned by illness but still defiant. I made Bill Monroe, you know, he'd say. He didn't have no bluegrass till I come along. I put the drive in it, and he never forgave me for it. He obsessed over the Opry, the blackballing, the injustice, a veteran still fighting a battle the world had declared over. The institutions he railed against simply waited. The grand old Opry, the fortress he had spent a lifetime trying to breach, never opened its doors. Even with Monroe gone, the father's veto held. The king would die in exile. But as the end drew near, as the cancer spread, the impenetrable walls of that legendary Martin pride began to show tiny hairline cracks. The king was dying, and James Henry, the scared, wounded son, was beginning to emerge. There are two pieces of evidence from these final years, two secrets of rage and regret, that, when placed side by side, give us the final, true, and contradictory picture of who this man was. The first secret was found after his death. Tucked away in his belongings was a cache of cassette tapes recorded by Jimmy himself during the 1980s. They were not music, but his private record of the conflict. On these tapes, Jimmy, alone, his voice raw with anger, meticulously documented every slight, every betrayal, every perceived act of sabotage by Bill Monroe. It was a secret diary of the war, a list of grievances from a man obsessed. This was the king building his legal case against the father, bitter, meticulous, and unable to let go. The second secret was the man. In 2002, just a year before he died, Jimmy Martin, frail and his voice a whisper, gave one of his last interviews. The interviewer was likely expecting the usual tirade, the "I made him" speech, but this time, the king was not in the room. Jimmy sat there quiet for a long moment. The fire was gone. All that was left was the truth. He looked at the interviewer, his eyes completely unguarded, shook his head, and whispered 5 simple words that explained the 50-year war. Bill was family. Bill was family. It wasn't a confession. It was a surrender. It was the final devastating admission from the ultimate prodigal son. The entire war was never a battle for a crown. It was a battle for a father's love. It was about the boy from Sneedville finally finding a father in Bill Monroe, and then, in his own proud, self-destructive way, doing everything he could to make that father reject him. And it was about the father, Bill Monroe, so wounded by his own past, so terrified of betrayal, that he did the only thing his pride knew how to do. He excommunicated him. The whole ugly 50-year tragedy was a simple, heartbreaking family dispute. The son screaming, "Why don't you love me?" And the father screaming, "Why did you betray me?" On May 14th, 2005, James Henry Martin died. The king was dead. The fire was out. The war was truly, finally over. Bill Monroe's legacy is as solid as granite. He was the architect, the father who built a lonely fortress out of pain in Rosine, Kentucky. He won the merit battle with all the accolades, Grammys, and undisputed status as the Father of Bluegrass. His name was on the patent, and his status was assured even in his lifetime. The other road from Sneedville, Tennessee belonged to Jimmy Martin. Hurt by the world, he learned to scream and fight. He was the king with a burning fire. In his lifetime, that fire, with alcohol and rage, got him banished from the kingdom. But after his death, those issues faded, leaving only his voice and music. For 5 magical years, the architect's fortress and the king's fire merged, creating a perfect, aching, lonely sound. But it was too unstable. The architect's fear could not control the fire, and the fire's pride could not be contained. The great American tragedy is that both were right, and their legacy is not just the music they created, but also 40 years of masterpieces that died in the silence of hatred. Finally, the historical institutions began to correct the narrative. In 1995, Jimmy Martin was inducted into the Bluegrass Hall of Fame, an honor he received while Bill Monroe was still alive, a crack in the ice wall. But the ultimate validation, the Grand Ole Opry, remained locked. Jimmy Martin died in 2005, forever an outsider to the mother church he so desperately wanted to join. The father's veto had outlasted them both, but the story doesn't end there. Nearly 20 years after his death, in 2022, the king received his final crown. Jimmy Martin was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. The war is over. The father and the son, Bill Monroe and Jimmy Martin, are finally equals forever, their plaques hanging side by side in the same hallowed hall. The king may have never been allowed into the father's house, but he was finally recognized as an equal in the kingdom. And in that shared immortality, all that remains is harmony.